Hello, my name is Andrej and you're watching the Serbian History Games channel. This will be the second episode on World War II in Yugoslavia, a war where every good deed must be punished. Now, before I start talking about the events, I want to give a short intro and a few general remarks. I think they will be useful. So, this is not a story on the brave communist partisans and their inspired leader Tito, which liberated Yugoslavia with the help of the wise British. Okay, the communist partisans were indeed very brave, but otherwise the story is completely different. There are many actors involved, and there is much more complex information that is left out. There will be a lot of information that you won't find on Wikipedia. Or to be more precise, you will be able to find that information on Wikipedia, but if you read very, very carefully. Now, one of the things is that people tend to focus on the massacres done by right-wingers while, giving the left-wingers a slide. I don't get that. I mean, if it's a massacre, it's a massacre, regardless if the fascists did it or if the communists did it. Unfortunately, in Yugoslavia, there were a lot of massacres, and particularly, unfortunately for the Serbs, there were a lot of massacres done by both fascists and the communists. The other thing I want to mention are the sources. Now, amazingly enough, people lie. And they particularly tend to lie in times of war. As a kid, growing up in Yugoslavia, I was, indoctrinated with the official version of the events, and it was terrible. Now, for the people who read something about communism and communist behavior in general, this will come as no surprise that they tend to, be very free with the truth. Actually, they don't look at truth as facts. Truth is what the party needs. So, for instance, they tended to falsify documents in the 45 years they were in power. So people have been sifting through this for years. On the other hand, the British were influenced by a communist mole, but more on that later. It's reasonable to assume that the story sanitizes the communists as much as humanly possible, while at the same time trying to put as much mud on their opponents. Now, God knows the Germans and the Croatian Ustaše were bad enough, so this meant mostly trying to equate the Chetniks, or actually the Royal Yugoslav Army, with the Ustaše and paint them into some kind of Serbian equivalent. Now, enough on the intro, let's start with the story. It's March the 27th, 1941. Early morning. People gathered for a massive demonstration in Belgrade, and while they passed the streets, they passed by army units. Now, the army has already done their work. They have made a coup, and they have replaced the Prince Regent and the government which signed the pact with the Axis just a couple of days ago. This is the Serbian Revolution of 1941. Now, these people know that the result of this revolution would be war with Germany. The government actually did not really have any choice because France fell in 1940. Britain was far away and couldn't help. The Soviet Union was officially with Germany, and obviously the US was neutral. So the government did the rational thing, and they signed the pact with the Axis. The Serbs would have none of that. They would not abandon their old allies. So Britain won't stand alone. Now, this revolution bears all the hallmarks of Serbian character. To be frankly honest, Serbs are completely insane. Being one of them, I can tell you on good authority. Case in point, this is actually not the height of insanity. For instance, in 1999, the Serbs took on NATO. So this tiny speck here took all these countries there. And actually, NATO only won after they started targeting civilians. Exhibit B. Serbia was formed in 1815 after a successful revolt against the Turkish Empire. Now, Serbia is that little speck there on the map. Now, doing things like this obviously requires bravery. And I'm not talking about, they shot at us and we didn't run away bravery. I'm talking about, we are out of ammunition, so we'll use bayonets bravery. But it's not just that. Serbia was occupied by Turkey for 400 years. So the Serbs learned the value of freedom from oppression, both foreign oppression and internal oppression. When Serbia was liberated, the Serbs did not particularly care for despotic kings. They actually hacked the last one to death in 1903. After that, a parliamentary monarchy was established permanently, and internal freedom secured. The Serbs could start thinking about securing their freedom against foreign oppressors. In this, they came up with an idea. Actually, it wasn't them that came up with the idea, it was Croat intellectuals, but the Serbs took it up. Now, the idea was quite ingenious. Rather than trying to unite all their compatriots in one state, like for instance, the Romanians, Bulgarians, Germans, or Italians did, they wanted to unite all South Slavs in one state and create a big, strong Yugoslavia. And they actually managed to do it. They beat off an Austrian invasion in 1914 with the help of Montenegro. In 1915, they did take a huge hit from Austrians, Germans, and Bulgarians, but by 1918, they managed to breach the Salonika front and in a blitzkrieg knock out Bulgaria out of the war and liberate all the South Slavs. Now, Serbia lost a quarter of its population, and actually the South Slavs, they did do some massacres in Serbia while being members of the Austrian army. And, they kind of resented the Serbs for beating them. And, things can't be perfect all the time. The new country started off with a rocky start. Actually, the Croats were not interested in making a country with Serbia. They wanted to make a smaller rump Yugoslavia made up from Austrian territories, where they would be the main player. But they were quite welcoming for the Serbian army, which came into the seaside to kick out the Italians. Now, this rump Yugoslavia would include many Serbs who would actually have none of it. So a Yugoslavia was formed from Serbia, Montenegro, and the Austrian territories with the Serbian king as its head, but the Croat politicians were basically in opposition from day one. Now, the issue with creating this new state was whether to make internal borders which were historic or simply administrative. Croats wanted historic borders in order to include all Croats in their separate unit, probably with the aim of secession later on. Now, the Serbs realized this, of course, and they were against this because any Croat unit would include numerous Serbs in it. So they wanted to create a unitary state, and in the end, they managed to do that. Now, there was a communist presence also in this state, and the Communist Party was also banned. Contrary to expectations, the communists did not actually represent the working people because there were not that very many of them, but actually represented dissatisfied ethnic minorities in Montenegro and Macedonia. The Communist Party was soon banned, probably because also information what happened in Soviet Union came in, as a number of Russian refugees came into Yugoslavia and were settled in Serbia. So things were not great, but not terrible either. Which neatly brings me into the story on the economy. Not great either. Basically, Serbia was devastated. Montenegro was rather poor due to its geographical situation. The coastline was underdeveloped. And, actually, Bosnia had feudalism right up until 1918. But the north of the country was better developed with some industry, better agriculture, and Serbia soon started rebuilding, and actually the country was actually not too shabby by the time World War II began, as it had 8 or 9 airplane factories. The situation reached its low point in 1928 when a Serb MP shot 3 Croatian MPs after they insulted him. The king instituted a dictatorship to calm the situation down, and this situation led to the creation of a Croatian fascist/crusader group called Ustaše, which found refuge in Italy. The parliament resumed its work a couple of years later, but the king was assassinated in 1934 in Marseille by a group of Bulgarian and Croatian fascists. Now, this was a huge loss for Yugoslavia in general because the king was a strong figure and he was a strong French ally, in particular, French and Entente ally in general. This assassination was probably orchestrated by Mussolini because Italy had designs on the Adriatic coast. The king was replaced by a prince regent. He tried to navigate the situation, but he was simply not such a strong figure as the king was. The situation in Croatia started getting out of hand. Croats were, of course, complaining that they were being oppressed by the Serbs, I guess in comparison to the great time they had being ruled by Germans and Hungarians, and they started forming their own militia. Serbs, of course, saw this and they started joining the various Chetnik organizations. Now, since the situation was slowly drifting towards a bad place, the Prince Regent tried to make a deal with the Croat politicians and actually completely caved in and made a Greater Banovina of Croatia, which encompassed all ethnic Croatians in Yugoslavia, which is actually more favorable than the current borders of Croatia. Now, the Serbs were not very thrilled by this, nor were indeed other ethnic groups, but it had to do. Also, the Ustaše were not thrilled by this either because they wanted more. In any case, in 1940, France fell. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria very quickly declared for the Axis, and Yugoslavia found itself surrounded. Now, the rational solution was quite obvious, and the Prince Regent and the ruling party and the Croat and Slovene politicians decided that a pact needs to be signed with Germany, and the government promptly signed it on March 25th, 1941. However, for the Serbs, this was the last straw. They rebelled. Joining the pact meant betraying their old allies. This is simply something that couldn't be done. So, Serbian officers staged the coup, and Serbian people flooded the streets. So you see, this makes sense within the Serbian mentality. Now, making a country from various ethnic groups which have differing views on religion, culture, economy, whatever, and whose only use of their common language was to insult each other in parliament, and have that country fight Germany, the unstoppable juggernaut, in order to help their old, reliable friends the British. What could go wrong? In my next episode, things take an unexpected turn for the worse.